Chapter 14: The Journey to Rumblecusp. The wave chaser sliced through the rolling waves, the sun casting golden reflections across the open sea. Azmadan stood at the helm, the captain's hat perched proudly on his head, the wind tugging at his crimson cloak. The salty breeze carried the sounds of the ship, the creaking of wood, the rhythmic slap of waves against the hull, and the occasional shout of the crew as they adjusted the sails. Maddogg, leaning against the railing, smirked. "So, Big Red, now you're the captain. Who's your second in command?" Azmadan turned, adjusting the hat slightly before pointing at him. "You, obviously." Maddogg grinned. "Damn right. First Mate Maddogg has a nice ring to it." He straightened up and cracked his knuckles. "All right, Captain, where we headed?" Azmadan reached into his coat pocket and pulled out the weathered map Wensforth had given him back at Tide Peak Tower. He unfolded it on a barrel beside him, tracing his finger across the parchment. "Rumblecusp." Maddogg glanced at the map, eyes narrowing. "Never heard of it." Nathaniel, who had been leaning against the mast, arms crossed, raised an eyebrow. "That's because it's mostly uncharted. The island's covered in thick jungle, mountains, and gods know what else." Azmadan smirked. "Sounds like an adventure." The journey to Rumblecusp took 2 full days. Though the waters were relatively calm, the wave chaser still rocked gently with the rhythm of the waves. No sea creatures or pirates harassed them, leaving the crew with plenty of time to entertain themselves. On the first night, Azmadan, Maddogg, and Nathaniel joined a handful of the crew below deck, where a game of cards had begun. A lantern flickered above the wooden table as the crew laughed, slammed down cards, and exchanged coin purses. Maddogg leaned back, his toothy grin widening. "I don't even need to cheat to beat you lot." One of the sailors, a burly human with a scar over his eye, scowled. "That's what a cheat would say." Nathaniel chuckled, tossing a few coins into the pot. "You'd be better off worrying about your own hand." Azmadan watched his cards thoughtfully before setting them down. "I'll fold. No sense in throwing good gold after bad luck." Maddogg swept the pot toward himself with a smirk. "Ah, Big Red, you gotta have more faith in Lady Luck." The game went late into the night, stories being shared between hands. The crew spoke of past voyages, near-death encounters with sea monsters, and superstitions about cursed waters. Azmadan listened carefully, absorbing every tale. Stories often held kernels of truth hidden within them. During the second day, Maddogg and a few of the crew spent their time constructing cage traps near the stern of the ship, reinforcing the wooden frames with metal spikes and rope mechanisms. "These should hold a basilisk, right?" one of the crew asked, hammering a nail into place. Maddogg inspected the sturdy cage, giving it a few experimental shakes. "As long as they don't chew through metal, yeah. Besides, that's what the reinforced locks are for." Azmadan watched from the helm. "Let's just hope we don't have to use them on ourselves if things go wrong." The wave chaser rocked gently as its crew lowered rowboats into the shallow waters off Rumblecusp's shore. The jungle loomed ahead, its dense foliage whispering in the salty breeze, vines draping over thick, ancient trees. Brightly colored birds flitted between the branches, their cries mixing with the crash of waves against the black volcanic sands of the beach. As the crew disembarked, Maddogg jumped onto the shore first, his boots sinking slightly into the damp sand. He stretched his arms, taking in the sight of the untamed island. "Right, let's get to work. I want tents up, a fire pit dug, and those cages spread around the perimeter." The crew immediately sprang into action, carrying barrels of supplies, crates of salted meat, and bundles of wood salvaged from the ship's stores. The sound of hammering filled the air as wooden stakes were driven into the ground, supporting the framework for tents. Azmadan stood near the jungle's edge, studying the map while Nathaniel, arms crossed, watched the organized chaos unfold. A few sailors were already at work digging a fire pit, one muttering about hoping they wouldn't have to eat anything too exotic before the trip was over. A wiry half-elf named Sal grumbled as he struggled to tie a rope between 2 trees for a hammock. "You think this jungle's got big cats? 'Cause if it does, I ain't sleeping on the ground." Maddogg, hauling over a crate of supplies, snorted. "If anything drags you off in the night, just scream real loud so we know to run." The crew laughed, but there was an undercurrent of nervousness. No one had set foot on this island before, and no one knew what waited in the jungle. A team of sailors armed with axes and machetes began cutting down thick palm branches to form a defensive wall around the camp. Maddogg supervised as wooden spikes were driven into the ground, forming a barrier that would at least slow down anything creeping too close in the night. With the fortifications underway, he turned his attention to the cage traps. "All right, listen up," Maddogg called, waving over a few sailors. "We're dealing with basilisks, turn you to stone if you so much as meet their beady little eyes. These cages need to be reinforced, and when we catch one, we move real slow. No heroics, no peeking." The traps were assembled just beyond the firelight, carefully placed along well-trodden animal trails leading into the jungle. The mechanisms were tested, the reinforced metal bars checked and double-checked. "That should hold AM," one of the crew muttered, slamming the heavy iron door shut on a test trap. Maddogg nodded, satisfied. "If not, well, we'll know soon enough." As the sun dipped lower, casting long shadows over the beach, the fire pit roared to life, orange flames flickering against the darkening jungle. The crew sat around it, passing around bottles of cheap rum and salted fish, swapping stories about past voyages and strange happenings on uncharted islands. Bob, lounging on a crate, chewed lazily on a strip of dried meat. "You lot ever think maybe we should have stayed in Nicodranas?" Nathaniel chuckled. "And miss the chance to discover something no one's ever seen before?" Azmadan smirked, folding up the map. "Where's the fun in that?" Maddogg, chewing on a piece of jerky, clinked his bottle against Azmadan's. "To Rumblecusp. Let's hope it doesn't kill us." The crew laughed, though some shifted uneasily, glancing toward the dark jungle that loomed just beyond the safety of the firelight. The first rays of sunlight pierced through the jungle canopy, casting long golden beams across the campsite. The air was thick with humidity, and the distant cries of unseen creatures echoed through the trees. A light mist clung to the undergrowth, shifting with the breeze as the crew stirred from their makeshift beds. Maddogg, already awake, was sharpening his greatsword near the dying embers of last night's fire. Azmadan emerged from his tent, stretching as he took in the early morning sounds of birds and distant rustling foliage. Nathaniel, sitting cross-legged near the fire, was polishing his blade. "So, Big Red," he said, smirking, "what's the plan today?" Azmadan pulled the weathered map from his coat pocket, unfolding it as he crouched down beside them. He traced a calloused finger over the inked parchment, stopping at the red marking deep within the jungle. "We're heading here. If the basilisks are anywhere, it's probably around this spot." Maddogg, tossing a piece of charred meat into his mouth, spoke between bites. "And if it's not basilisks?" Azmadan shrugged. "Then we keep looking." Nathaniel sighed, running a hand through his hair. "At least we'll have a good breakfast before heading out." Bob, walking past, threw a dry biscuit at Nathaniel. "Good is a stretch." The trio chuckled before grabbing some provisions, knowing they'd need the energy for the trek ahead. A small hunting party was assembled: Azmadan, Maddogg, Nathaniel, and 5 of the more seasoned crew members. Each was armed with spears, bows, or swords, their belts lined with knives and small pouches of dried rations. The jungle was dense, its pathways uneven, littered with twisting roots and thick vines. Every step forward was met with the squelch of damp earth, the air heavy with the scent of moss and distant flowers. The party walked for nearly an hour, pushing deeper into the jungle, when Maddogg raised a hand, signaling for silence. Ahead, in a small clearing, a herd of ox-like creatures was grazing. They had thick, shaggy fur, their horns curved like crescent moons, and they snorted softly as they tore at the lush undergrowth. Maddogg grinned. "Now that's a meal." Azmadan nodded, lowering his voice. "All right, spread out. We surround them and cut off their escape." The crew moved carefully, stepping lightly through the jungle brush, positioning themselves in a half-circle around the clearing. Maddogg drew his bow, an arrow already marked, while Nathaniel unsheathed his sword, preparing to strike. Azmadan raised a hand, preparing to give the signal to attack. And then the jungle erupted into chaos. A deafening, guttural roar shattered the stillness. The ox-like creatures shrieked in terror, their heads snapping up in panic before they bolted, trampling the undergrowth as they fled for their lives. Before anyone could react, trees cracked and splintered apart, massive roots tearing from the ground as something enormous barreled through the foliage. A massive shadow loomed over them, the earth trembling beneath its weight. Nathaniel's eyes went wide. Oh, shit. The creature was fast, much faster than anything its size should have been. It burst into the clearing with terrifying ferocity, its jaws wide, teeth gleaming like daggers in the morning light. One of the crewmen, a burly half-orc, barely had time to turn before the creature snapped its jaws shut around him, lifting him clean off the ground. His blood-curdling scream was cut short as he was crushed in a sickening crunch, his weapon clattering to the ground. Maddogg dodged as a massive tail whipped past him, splintering a nearby tree. "We're gonna need bigger weapons." Azmadan threw out a hand, channeling a blast of crackling lightning, the energy surging forward and slamming into the beast's side. The jungle illuminated with the explosion, and the creature let out a furious roar, staggering back momentarily. Nathaniel rolled beneath it, his blade slicing along its underbelly, drawing thick, blackened blood. The remaining crew scrambled to fight back, arrows flew, swords flashed, and spells crackled through the air. But the creature fought like an unstoppable force, its sheer power and size overwhelming. One sailor attempted to run, only for a clawed foot to crash down upon him, pinning him into the dirt before he could escape. Azmadan gritted his teeth. "We need to take this thing down before it kills us all." Maddogg, breathing heavily, leapt onto a nearby boulder, gaining height before launching himself onto its back, gripping its rough hide as he stabbed down with his great sword. The beast howled, bucking wildly as it tried to throw him off. Nathaniel took the opening and plunged his sword into its exposed neck, twisting the blade as dark blood sprayed across the jungle floor. Azmadan raised his hands, summoning one final surge of fire, unleashing the full brunt of his magic at the creature's head. The air shimmered with heat, and the beast let out a final pained roar before it collapsed with a thunderous crash, the jungle shaking from the impact. The survivors stood in silence, panting heavily, weapons still raised as the massive body of the beast lay still before them. The jungle was eerily quiet, the usual buzzing of insects and distant bird calls gone. Maddogg, covered in blood and dirt, yanked free one of its massive teeth, holding it up with a grin. "That's going on the necklace." Nathaniel, wiping sweat from his forehead, shook his head. "I think I'll just take the memory, thanks." Azmadan, still catching his breath, glanced at the carcass. "Might as well make use of it. Get some meat back to camp." The remaining crew hacked away portions of its hide and flesh, filling their packs with whatever they could carry before setting off back toward the beach. Maddogg spat on the ground, glancing at the jungle ahead. "That was a hell of a warm-up. What's next?" Azmadan pulled out the map, his fingers tracing the red mark. "Now we see what Wensforth wanted us to find." As they drew closer to the marked spot, the jungle became eerily silent. The usual sounds of birds and insects vanished, replaced by a strange, unnatural stillness. Then they saw them, creatures frozen in stone, twisted mid-motion, their expressions locked in terror. Some were mid-step, others looked as though they had been fleeing from something unseen. Azmadan muttered, "Basilisks." Maddogg knelt beside one of the statues, inspecting its lifelike detail. "Looks fresh." They quickly set up one of the traps before pressing deeper. Then, nestled beneath a mound of overgrown vines, they spotted it, a strange, metallic door embedded in the ground, its smooth steel surface gleaming beneath the dirt. Azmadan ran his hand along the edge. "This isn't normal." Nathaniel gritted his teeth. "What the hell is something like this doing here?" With effort, they pried the door open, revealing a dimly lit metal corridor lined with glowing panels. The trio exchanged wary glances before stepping inside.